Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are looking forward to the presentation with Neal Fried. And we will wait for just a couple of more minutes for the rest of the attendees to join. Good morning. Good morning, good morning. I'm going to go ahead and click record so that we can have record of this awesome conversation. More and more joining every second. Good morning, Jason. Thank you. Nice to see you. Welcome. We've got about close to 100 on the call now. We are very much looking forward to this conversation with Neal. Good morning, James. Good morning, Keith. Thank you for joining us today. We're just going to wait for one more minute and allow a few more to join. I see the meeting room is filling up. Thanks, everyone. Just a quick reminder, we are recording this webinar today, and we will be happy to take your questions at the end of the presentation. You can ask us a question by using the Q&A on the bottom of the toolbar down below. You can also ask us a question by raising your hand and we will unmute you. Just going to give it about 30 more seconds. All right, I think we can go ahead and begin. Thanks again, everyone, for joining today. We are recording this session, and if you would like to ask us a question, we welcome your questions. Please put them in the chat and we will get to the questions after the session, or you are welcome to raise your hand and we will unmute your line at the end of the presentation. All right, Marty, take it away.
Excellent. Thank you, Marie. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us in today's presentation with State of Alaska economist Neal Fried regarding the 2021 economic outlook. As a point of introduction, my name is Marty Odsaither. I'm a fourth generation Alaskan, and I'm the district manager for Crescent Electric here in Alaska. I'd also like to take a moment to especially thank and recognize our esteemed partners and colleagues at Eaton for participating and sponsoring this event. We truly do appreciate your contributions to today's event. I think it's fair to say that 2020 was a pretty unusual moment in time. And as residents and business leaders, we all experienced a pretty historic watershed moment together. As we migrated to 2021, we've been asked and have discussed repeatedly, what does 2021 look like? We knew that some economic insight into 2021 would be helpful in how we model our 2021 plans, and began to think, you know what, we're all in this together, and Alaskans might have some interest in mutually attending an event like this as well. So we put it together, and I just wanted to say thank you again for taking the time out of your schedules, and thank you for taking the time to attend. A little bit about Crescent Electric in Alaska. Crescent Electric has been in the Alaska construction infrastructure since 1996. We have 4 locations across the state: Anchorage, Fairbanks, Kenai, and Wasilla. We serve commercial and residential construction, mining, oil patch, utility, power generation, school education, institutional, and a lot more. With that being said, I'd like to take a moment to introduce and thank Seth Erickson. He's our Chief Transformation Officer for Crescent Electric for joining us today. We know he's a busy guy, but I'd like to, again, take the moment to say thank you. And I'm going to turn the mic over to Seth, as they say. And I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you again for everybody. This should be a pretty interesting and informative event.
Yeah, thanks, Marty. So first of all, I want to thank all Crescent customers that carved out time this morning to spend with us and talking about what's on the horizon with economics in Alaska. So it should be a really good session. So, and thanks again to Eaton, our sponsor. So again, I think this is going to be valuable time. We're going to work hard to make it valuable time for you. Thanks for giving that to us. So I am the Chief Transformation Officer at Crescent Electric, and there's just a terrific amount of exciting things on the horizon for us at Crescent. So we're going to be spending the next number of years on a very heavy lift, multi-year transformation to really remap our distribution network, work on process enhancements and consistency across the United States, and completely retool and rebuild a digital ecosystem that just helps us serve you better day in and day out. So a tremendous amount going on. I'm on board here at Crescent to provide some functional responsibility for some key parts of the business, but also to make sure that these very ambitious goals that we're setting all get lined up and knocked down, that we bring them to fruition so that we can better serve you more consistently. Terrific example in your backyard in Alaska. We've been working with Marty recently on retrofitting the warehouse there, setting up a quick pull zone, working on putting some agile methodologies in place within his distribution out of his facilities. And what that means to you is faster service, improved product availability, and just a better overall service level. And so we've been doing a lot of work with Alaska over the last few months. That will continue. It's a focus for us, and it's also serving as a roadmap for us in how we can learn and do better in a lot of our geographies across the United States. So, Marty and his team have been terrific in working with us, and some of my transformation team members to get his operations shored up so that we can serve you better each and every day. So thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it. Looking forward to the discussion today. I believe there's going to be plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So we'll hear what Neal has to say in a little bit. But before that, I want to turn it over to Dave Dickerson from Eaton. So Dave, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Seth. Yeah, I'm Dave Dickerson with Eaton Corporation. I'm a senior sales engineer here in Alaska. A little bit about Eaton for those of you who don't know that much about us. Eaton is, we manufacture circuit breakers and electrical switchgear, motor control equipment, the big, the gray boxes that you see on the wall in a lot of electrical rooms. Eaton was founded in 1911. We got involved in the electrical distribution equipment in 1978 when we acquired Cutler Hammer. And then Cutler Hammer was founded in 1892. Eaton acquired the electrical distribution division of Westinghouse in 1994. And that's a familiar name for a lot of you. Westinghouse was founded in 1886 by George Westinghouse. Eaton's enjoyed a strong relationship with Crescent for many, many years. They're our largest stocking distributor in Alaska. We work closely with them to support them in the electrical construction and MRO markets. Over this past year, Eaton, we experienced significant challenges just like everybody else. The pandemic, affected our manpower at our manufacturing plants. The sudden increase in e-commerce, kind of disrupted our shipping, and it just really took a lot for us to work through all those issues And as a result, we poured about 200 million into our infrastructure to help overcome some of those problems. We also invested a lot into our software and our online capabilities to help us adapt to the changing marketplace. So I think we're all kind of dealing with a lot of the same issues, I think. I guess main thing to mention here is that we want to we're proud to sponsor this event. Working with Crescent and getting this information from Neal, I think it's really important for all of us to understand what's going on in our marketplace. Neal, I'm going to introduce him now. Neal is an economist with the state of Alaska. He's been an economist for, I think, over 30 years, right, Neal?
40.
Wow. And he's seen Alaska go through several different downturns, and he's familiar with all the issues that affect our economy, and he's just got some great experience. So we're looking forward to hearing what he says. So I'll turn it over to you, Neal.
All right, let's see. Let's hope this. Oh, here it is. No. Okay, let's see. There we go. So can it be seen?
We can see it, Neal. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone. It's just great to be here. It's a beautiful sunny day, which will improve my mood, and I'll probably be more optimistic than I would have been a couple of days ago. I'm going to move pretty quickly because I have, as usual, too many slides. If you want more detail, and some of you are probably aware of this, and I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity, because a lot of times we spend a lot of time producing numbers, generating articles, looking at the economy, but we don't get to share it with folks, and this gives us that opportunity. The other opportunity we always have is we produce, and some of you are probably familiar with it, this monthly publication, Alaska Economic Trends, that you can actually subscribe to electronically, and it's free. You just go to our website, or if you like the paper versions, we still have that, although we do charge you a little bit for that. I'm going to be, well, let's just move into this, because I want time, I want there to be time for questions at the end of this. One thing I do have to warn you folks is I don't talk about public policy. In other words, I'll give you opinions about the economy, or where I think the economy is going to go, or what role different industries play. But if it's a public policy question, I'm not likely to entertain that, because it's called self-preservation. And I'm sort of in the business of producing sort of objective economic data. That's what we do, so that people can make better decisions. This is maybe the most important slide I'm going to share with you. In fact, I'm going to give you so much background that you're going to be able to produce your own forecast, although I'll share our forecast with you. People have different opinions, and forecasting is, art, not a science. And I think you'll have enough information to come up with your own opinion about what the outlook for Alaska looks like. And I know we have a lot of different geographies here, which are sort of hard to cover, but I'm going to try to cover some of it. This is what sort of has happened to Alaska in the last 10 years. And it's this slide here, kind of what has been happening during the last 10 years is going to have a gigantic influence of what's going to happen this year and what's going to happen next year, and probably 3 or 4 years into the future. And our last 10 years in Alaska has been really quite different than the nation has experienced. This was a headline in a recent Wall Street Journal. Yellen expects U.S. economy to return to full employment in 2022. So what she's saying is that by 2022, the U.S. economy is going to move back to where it was pre-COVID or in 2019. And remember, when at 2019, at the end of 2019, the U.S. economy was at record high levels. Employment, GDP had never seen such heights. We had grown for longer than any period of time since World War II, the national economy. And, unemployment had reached almost near record lows. Well, our story is a little bit different, and you're aware of that. You've been here. Prior to the COVID recession in 2020, we had another recession, a pretty tough one in 16, 17, and 18, where we lost a significant number of jobs. Then we had a little bit of reprieve in 2019 when we saw some recovery occurring, and then we got hit by the great surprise of last year. And what that basically has done to us, if we look back, we have to look back to somewhere between 2003 and 4 to find equivalent levels of economic activity that we're experiencing now. So we have a lot more ground to make up to move into full recovery, if that's important. I'm not sure what that means, but if we are to move back to where we were in our previous peak, which was back in 2015, it's going to take a lot longer than 2022. Now, it's possible that we will recover our losses of 2020 by 2022. Well, that's a little bit optimistic, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Our economy is different than the rest of the countries. We do beat to a different drummer in many ways, except this COVID recession. This is the first time we really experienced a recession at the same time as the rest of the country. I just want to go through sort of some of the details of what happened last year and what is still happening this year in 2021. I don't want to belabor these numbers because we've all heard about them. We've been hearing about them during the whole last year and the beginning of this year as well. But as you can see, it's been incredibly broad. Basically, every industry has experienced some of this, the negative fallout from COVID, but some a lot more than others. Leisure and hospitality, we've heard so much about that. These numbers are very similar in many ways compared to other parts of the country, but leisure and hospitality is the one that got hammered the most. That's restaurants or eating and drinking, hotels, and entertainment. And they just really, because of distancing, have been really hit hard. But others as well, transportation. We all know what's happened there, especially air transportation, but other parts of transportation as well. Retail. I don't want to go through all these. Some of the more unique ones for us that have been hit pretty hard, and we'll talk about this a little more, is oil. Basically, the only sector that did not lose ground last year was the federal government. But we'll talk about other parts of the economy that actually did fairly well. This is just gives you a feel for what it looks like on a sort of proportional basis. And it's pretty similar. You can see leisure and hospitality. I mean, they lost basically a quarter of their activity in 2020. But oil and gas then rose to number 2. It got hit hard because we all know what happened to the price of oil. You watch the price of oil, you can watch where the oil industry goes. And, we all know that we experienced a strange period of negative oil prices for a very short period of time. But there's good news on the front there. And then, you can go down. None of these sectors have yet recovered. The one sector that's getting close to recovery is healthcare. And strangely, healthcare was one of the industries that we thought would actually do well during COVID, but we all know what happened there because of distancing. But that is one industry that's recovering quite nicely right now. And this is the latest. These are the latest numbers that came out in January. They came out actually last Friday. We sent these out in a press release. And you can see that, our losses got as bad as losing almost 20% of our 18% of our jobs. It's down to, we're negative 7.5% compared to a year ago. And that's what we're always doing. Because of the seasonality of Alaska's economy, it's really important. But if you look down the line, we're still, almost all sectors are taking still a pretty big hit this year. And Legion Hospitality is still taking a very, very large hit. And let me bring back the idea of seasonality. That's, Alaska has the most seasonal economy in the United States by a long shot. We all know that a significant more activity takes place during that sort of April, May through September, October period in Alaska. And the problem during the last year was that the timing was terrible for Alaska. And that's because we were just beginning to gear up in 2020 and into our busiest season, and then we lost so much of it, more so than a lot of other places. So that was sort of an extra hit that we took as far as COVID goes. We lost more ground on average than the rest of the country did. We weren't the worst. You can imagine a place like Hawaii probably got hit the hardest. Now, let me say this. Our numbers in COVID in 2020 really started turning negative in March and April, especially April of last year. So our numbers this year in 2021 are likely to remain negative through February or March. And then our over the year gains, we'll start to see over year gains probably in March or April. In other words, the news will be, wow, finally Alaska is beginning to have more jobs in 2021 than it did in 2020. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail later on. This is just to give you some idea of where we are. I would normally talk about the unemployment rate, but COVID has done some it's even affected the way data is collected and generated. And it's not doing a very good job generating unemployment rates for Alaska. And unemployment rates have never been a very good economic indicator anyhow. This is the insured unemployment rate. Our most recent insured unemployment rate, and I go into explaining it, but we don't really have time, is about 6.5%. The green line was the previous year. So our unemployment rate basically is twice as high today as it was a year ago. That's the only sort of point I want to make with this slide. This one here, which is a confusing slide, the only point I want to make here is this is the number of people in Alaska that are receiving unemployment claims or receiving unemployment on a weekly basis. And you can see right now it's about 40,000 folks, individuals in Alaska that are receiving unemployment. That's down from the peak. This is pretty current data through early March. The numbers below don't pay any attention to, they got screwed up. The black line is what happened a year ago. So the number of people receiving unemployment in Alaska today still remains about 3 to 4 times as many as we had a year ago, although we're seeing some improvement take place there. Now, this has been a really bizarre, kind of strange recession in some really odd ways. And you all know that. We've all had strange experiences. This is not just a classic economic recession. At the same time that we've lost a significant number of jobs and economic activity, personal income, this is income that are coming into people's pockets, has increased in 2020. In other words, people actually have more money to spend in 2020 or did in 2020 than they did the previous year. Now we do hear that the folks in the lower wage jobs have been hit harder by this recession. That's very, very true because some of those industries like leisure and hospitality, like retail, tend to be very low wage industries, and they've been disproportionately hit. But at the same time, with all the federal money flowing into the state in different programs and such, people's income, majority of those folks who did lose income as a result of job losses actually are receiving more income now than they were when they were employed. And it's also true that, the dividend checks started showing up again. I got mine on Sunday, and so did a lot of other people. My daughter got them on Saturday. So the income picture is strangely very different than the employment picture. This here is just previous recessions that Alaska have experienced. Some of you have experienced some of these. This is by far the fastest recession. We've lost more jobs in this recession in a short period of time than we ever have. We've actually lost more jobs in this recession than we ever have. That's not necessarily true proportionally. Our economy is bigger, but proportionally, you can see we're catching up with the 80s as far as job loss, and we'll probably surpass it. Now, is this a worse recession in the 80s? I would say absolutely not. It was very, very different. But when we look at the job numbers, it's looking pretty similar than the 1980s. Alaska's had fewer recessions, believe it or not, than the rest of the country. This is the geography. Different parts of the state have felt this COVID recession differently, some more than others. The area that has been hit the hardest on a percent basis is Southeast Alaska. Southeast, we all know, is disproportionately dependent on the cruise ship sector, which basically did not exist last year. And on top of that, they got hit by a terrible fishing season. So they got really hammered. At one point, their transportation employment in Southeast last summer was down by over 80%, because a lot of their transportation employment is tied very directly to the visitor sector. But you can see it varied. On the other hand, you have Southwest Alaska, which was sort of the Bristol Bay region and the Aleutian Islands, and that got hit less for a number of reasons. One, they, for most part, had a pretty good fishing season, which is their big industry. They also don't have a big, broad service sector. They don't have a big, broad leisure and hospitality sector or a big, broad retail sector. Sectors that got hit really hard by COVID, they don't exist in Southwest Alaska nearly to the extent that they do other places. So they fared a lot better. And you can see, Anchorage and the Matsu a little less. Matsu is really interesting. I wish I could go into detail, but they actually saw some growth in retail in Matsu during the COVID year, which was unusual. They also saw growth in healthcare. It was Matsu is sort of a standout in some of the numbers, but you can see it varies around the state in Alaska. Gulf Coast is your Kenai Peninsula, your Valdez, Cordova region, Kodiak, sort of a mixed bag there. Got hit hard with the visitor sector. Fishing was in there. It's a pretty diverse sector, had different impacts. Here, I just wanted to show this one slide because oil's been so important. And one of the big weaknesses that we've had in our economy now for not just the last year, but actually the last 4 or 5 years has been what's happened in the oil sector. This is oil industry employment around the state. It peaked, believe it or not, our all-time peak, it was in 2015 at 15,000. And you can see we're down to something less than 7 today. We did start seeing a recovery in early 2020. 2020 was supposed to be a good year. And then we all know what happened to oil during COVID. This is what happened. Oil prices collapsed. But the good news is, and oil industry employment and activity is actually still contracting, but the good news is oil prices have recovered pretty nicely, better than most people thought. In fact, the last couple of weeks, it's been in the high 60s. It's profitable again. We're not seeing that positive turnaround in employment or activity yet, but you have to get this before that occurs. So things are looking certainly better in the oil patch. in Alaska, and that's good news. You know, I think sometimes we don't give our state as much, you know, as the diversity that exists in our economy as much credence as it really kind of deserves. Now, mining is a relatively small industry in Alaska, but mining did pretty well during COVID. Prices have been good, activity's been high, they've dealt with COVID pretty well. So that's been a sort of one of the more shining positive lights in our economy. So is the military. After many, many years of really stagnating, military numbers are beginning to creep up. A lot of this is, of course, you all know as contractors involved in construction, that's where the action was the previous couple of years. That action is slowing down, but now the folks, the Air Force folks are actually showing up in person. So that's another positive in our economy. Here's, you know, one of the industries that's gotten hit really hard. This is the number of people that get frisked at the airport in Anchorage. And you can see it's still down by 43%. I mean, but activity is beginning to get a little bit better in our airports. You might have heard last weekend was the best weekend the country had seen so far in a long time in airport activity. You can see both Fairbanks, Anchorage, you know, we're still down pretty hard, but this is one of the areas where I think there's a lot of pent up demand, and these numbers are beginning to improve, and I think will begin to improve very quickly as we get the virus under control. This is the forecast for construction. I think it's sort of, it looks very negative. Construction activity has been very flat to negative for a number of years. I think a lot of this is biased by a loss of activity that's taking place on the North Slope or in the oil industry, and not as much as your sort of vertical, horizontal highway construction, although that outlook is obviously not great right now with the capital budget and such for this next year. And many of you probably seen this forecast that Alaska General Contractors has done every year by the McKinsey Research. Here's, I'm going to skip this one. This is another one of the weird stories. Well, not weird stories. This is just an example. And if you look at Fairbanks and elsewhere, you know, the visitor industry, this is another for the casualties and is representative of the loss of revenues to a lot of communities. This is just the room tax. And in most communities that have sales taxes or bed taxes or other types of taxes tied to the visitor industry, you know, they've fallen by as much as 50 or 60%. Particularly hit hard has been the Southeast communities, but it's been again experienced around the state. This is the weird part of our economy that, you know, if you had asked me a year ago that this was going to happen, COVID was going to hit, and 2020 was going to be a very tough year in the nation's and in Alaska's economy, what's going to happen to real estate, I certainly would not have guessed this. I mean, we've had one of the strangely best years in sales, and this is true across the country. It's not just in Alaska, but one of the best ones in Alaska in a long time. Part of it's, I think, that positive income story, and there are all kinds of other theories, but it's interesting. It has not been followed by a big housing boom by any means. I think when we finally get the housing unit numbers, new housing units being built in 2020, it's not going to be that much different than 2019, but sales and values have definitely gone up. So is vacancy. We don't have 2021 yet. We will have it very, very soon. But my guess is on the rental market, it's a little different. That's been flatter. If you have rental property, you probably haven't been able to increase rents. Rents have actually drifted down a little bit. Some of this is, of course, tied to population losses and more people moving into ownership, home ownership. This was one that Alaskans are always worried about when we go into a slow period for our economy. Everyone, you know, we look back to your left, you see what happened in the 1980s, and we're always paranoid. Thank God most people are too young now in Alaska to remember what happened in the 1980s. But those that do are always worried that we're going to see a repeat of that. We're obviously not. Foreclosures at our near record lows, and I don't think that's going to change. So that certainly is not even closely begin to manifest itself, and I don't think will at all. This is another one of the sort of the positive stories that's occurred. Part of it's for a lot of different reasons, but this is international air cargo coming into the state. And the blue line is 2021. You can see that's fiscal 2021. So it's been going on for a while. They're very busy. This has been great for places like Atlas Air, FedEx, UPS, China Air, all those carriers. They've been doing very well as e-commerce has continued to grow as a result of the pandemic. The other big reason is because commercial passenger airlines have been traveling less. There's been a lot less of them. They do carry a lot of cargo when they're flying. And of course, they're carrying a lot less. So the cargo carriers have benefited from this as well. And then just COVID-related materials traveling from Asia to North America to Europe have increased. So this is one of the real positives out there in Alaska's economy. Now, I just want to talk about population a little bit. It's not a pretty story. We're all wondering what COVID impacts might have on population, and we're still not quite sure what those are. What we did see, and that's just say a loss of 1,200 residents. I don't know why I haven't fixed that little comment in there. But we basically saw what happened in 2020 to our population was very similar to what we've seen during the last 4 or 5 years. You know, our population peaked back in 2016 and has drifted slowly down moderately each year for the past 4 to 5 years. And what's important here is to look at the details of what that has been, you know, because what people often see when they hear about population loss is they visualize this huge exodus of people leaving. And in fact, what's been a bigger part of what's happened in Alaska is not more people leaving. That number has not changed a lot. What has changed is the number of people coming to Alaska has declined pretty dramatically. The national economy has been doing really well for a long time until this last year. When the national economy does well, there's no reason for people to necessarily move, and Americans are moving less than they have been for a number of years. And we're sort of a casualty of that. But that's the bigger explainer of our job losses. Now, somewhat worrisome, and we just came out with this in the March issue of Alaska Economic Trends, is general migration. And Alaska has not been doing very well relative to the rest of the country. In fact, we've lost more of our population as a percent to net out migration. In other words, more people moving out than moving in than any other state in the United States when we look at that 5-year average. And this is somewhat worrisome, and a lot of it is certainly tied to our economy and how it's been performing relative to the rest of the country. Here's just I'm about to share with you our forecast. This is my record for forecasts. And the purple's actual, the red is what actually happened. You can see I did pretty well until 2020. And this is our forecast. And then we did this before we thought we realized that we were going to lose the cruise ship season probably altogether. And we still pretty much believe that's going to be what's going to happen. But in spite of that, we still think we are actually maybe too conservative. So we do think numbers are going to turn positive in Alaska's economy. We're going to start seeing growth and employment in Alaska's economy. But you can see that growth, if it's anywhere close to reality for 2021, it's going to take a while to make up for those previous losses that we've had starting back in 2016. And then this is the detail, which is kind of the flip side of the losses. I don't think it's surprising that leisure and hospitality is going to probably gain the most because it lost the most. Most leisure and hospitality in Alaska is tied to local consumption, us going out to be entertained, us to go out and eat. Hotels are more closely tied to the visitor industry, but it is heavily affected by the visitor industry as well. We do think we're going to have a better visitor season this year. I was talking to one of the all-time experts in tourism in Alaska, and the way he described the visitor season this year as it's like sort of a snowball going downhill. He thought that it would start out slowly and sort of gain momentum as the year went on. We're looking really good as far as vaccines go. This is open air. I think we'll see a nice increase in independent tourism this year, but obviously we can't regain all the losses from the loss of cruise ships. Cruise ships bring in about half of our visitors each year. So that's going to take a while for the visitor industry to come back. Retail is going to come back too as people feel more comfortable. Retail probably will never come back to its previous high, and that's because of e-commerce. Retail was suffering even before this because of the pressure of e-commerce, and that pressure just increased in 2020. And you just go down the line. We do still think oil and gas will lose some ground in 2020, although it should start turning positive towards the end of the year. These are the details. This is where we're more likely to make errors. Another industry that I should say that I didn't represent well in here is fishing. Last year's, it was sort of a mixed year, but it adds diversity to our economy. It was affected by COVID, not as much as our production was, but prices kind of took a hit as a result of COVID. So that also should improve the outlook for our economy this year. And the forecast for this year, for this year's season, just came out recently, and that also is looking better than last year. And this is just a percent basis of where we're when we begin on the mend. We think that employment, their economy is going to grow by 3%. So we're really predicting sort of modest growth. There are optimists out there that think that that growth could be even greater than this. There is no doubt that pent-up demand, I think, is going to play the biggest role in our economy in 2021 in Alaska. But we're going to still face big challenges with the oil sector, with our fiscal picture, but things should start turning positive. I have a few other trivial, or not trivial, but just interesting data. I know a lot of you use the cost of living index each year to adjust wages or rents or that. Strangely, for the first time in our history, and the minimum wage is actually adjusted by the CPI. I don't know what they're going to do with this year, last year, but for the first time ever in our history, we actually had deflation in 2020. That's not going to happen again this coming year. A lot of that's tied to what happened to the price of energy. A little of it's tied to housing, which I don't completely understand. This next slide I just want to share with you because I think this is a real positive for Alaska's economy, and it's just been occurring over a long period of time, and that is the cost differential between sort of on-the-road system economy in Alaska versus the rest of the country. The cost of doing business, the cost of living has improved a lot. You can see, and I'm just using Anchorage and Seattle's examples because we have data for them. But you can see up until 2010, our prices were still above Seattle's, and you can see where how that's changed. And it's largely changed because the price of doing business, the price of housing, et cetera, the cost of living elsewhere in much of the country has increased much more rapidly than it has in Alaska. And then lastly, this is more of I used to have the pickup index, which has died because of the rules changed on how to register your vehicle, so I can no longer use that. So I'm using marijuana instead as an indicator. And I'll tell you, if the rest of the economy was doing as well as marijuana, we would have never had a recession. Reached another all-time peak in July of this year. It always peaks out during PFDs. We've had lots of PFDs this year. We just got that one from the feds this last week. It'll be interesting to see, but this is one industry that just keeps on growing. And those are all the comments I have, and I'll be happy to entertain questions if we have time.
Thank you, Neal. Let's go ahead and go right into the Q&A session. I have several that are ready to go for you. We'll start with Deborah. She is interested in the job loss gain in construction and real estate.
Real estate actually real estate fell less in 2020 than most other sectors of the economy. You would think that because real estate was positive, that would be positive for construction, and has been. We're not building a lot of more new homes in Alaska. We actually probably built fewer new housing units last year than this year, and I'm not sure why that is. It could have been the uncertainty. We sold more, prices are better, and there's certainly a lot more activity takes place for people fixing up homes. In fact, interestingly enough, on the retail side, it's the building supply stores, the Home Depots, and such, that have had a really good year last year. Those retailers, along with grocery stores, had a very good year in 2020. It'll be interesting to see if that trend continues. But because of smaller capital budgets, less activity in the oil sector, and just uncertainty out there, construction there's restraint going on for construction.
Thank you. Here's another question from Brad. The most disturbing trend appears to be the decline in private sector jobs in Alaska and the many years of population out migration. The private sector creates wealth and has a high multiplier effect. Do you agree that we are losing some of the most productive portion of our economy even before COVID hit? With over $6 billion of federal COVID relief funds injected into the state over the last year, is it possible that the bright spots in our economy is actually a short-term effect and the economy will decline much worse in the coming years after federal relief dries up?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And the part of it, the answer is absolutely yes. We were struggling before COVID. We had that terrible recession between 15, 16, or 16, 17, and 18. Big losses in the oil sector, which if you measure by the highest wages and revenues that the state receives job for job, we were losing some of our most productive part of our economy. And now with the change in technology, how much of that is going to recover? So, I'd have to agree with it. Now, we are worried, as this federal money, we've gotten this new injection, plays its way through the economy. Are we going to go back into recession? I think that's unlikely, but I think it's also unlikely that we're going to see strong growth in our economy either. I mean, that's why we believe, and most people who look at our economy believe, that it's going to take, a long time for our economy to even recover from the losses of last year, and even longer from the losses in the previous years. And our economy, even in the positive years in this last decade, was growing pretty slowly. So I think economic growth will be a challenge. And just to add to that, it hasn't just been private sector job losses. State job losses and local government have also been losing jobs. The state government's lost a lot of jobs as well. So yeah, it's very broad. And I think economic growth is going to be a challenge for Alaska, given what we know right now.
Okay, here's one from Kyle. Foreclosures are likely artificially low due to regulation preventing foreclosure. Once the regulation expires, do you believe foreclosures will flood the market? Do you have any idea of how many foreclosures are pent up?
I actually don't think hardly any are, and this is the reason. Um, Even though that exists out there, any house that would go into the housing market is quite robust right now, and I think it will remain that way through at least this year. And if that regulation wasn't there, I don't think the story would be any different because those houses will be sold. There's a demand for those homes. Foreclosures will only increase when the demand for housing falls off. Now, as the previous question was, how are we going to do, what's our economic growth going to look past 2021 or 2022? And that could become a little more worrisome, but I don't think we're going to see a foreclosure story for quite a while. We just don't have the overhang. We don't have a big supply of housing. And there's actually very little inventory. So I don't see that as a big issue, at least for the next couple of years.
How does Alaska fix its population problem? How do we decrease people moving out and increase people moving in?
Well, I have a bias. I mean, part of it's because I'm an economist. The economics is a big part of the story. Part of it we can do absolutely nothing about, and that is how well the American economy is doing. The fact is when the American economy is doing well, whether ours is doing okay or not, but if the American economy is doing well, people find less reason to move. And Americans are moving less than they ever have since World War II. We've become much less mobile as a national, in this country as a whole, which may not bode well for Alaska. So a lot of it's tied to the national economy. If the national economy does poorly, we will gain more population from in-migration. As long as it does well, it's going to be tougher. Now, the other half of it is how well is our economy doing? If we can support, if we have enough jobs, for example, the existing population, and those jobs pay well, or on average pay well, and we're attractive. I mean, it's the attractiveness of our economy and our labor market. And that's why I think we've seen this loss of we've had this negative outmigration. And before that, we've had very modest employment growth. So I do think a lot of it is tied to how attractive our economy is relative to the rest of the country, but other things as well, amenities. I think in the long term, believe it or not, I think global warming is going to play in Alaska's favor. I don't wish for global warming, but I think it already is having a positive effect on Alaska's economy in strange ways. And hopefully, most of the big things that have happened to our economy in the past have not been predicted, both the positive and negative things. And, there are usually some wild card that comes out of left field. I know we can't just depend on that, but migration is very much tied to how well we're doing relative to the rest of the country. Some of it's demographics as well. Our population is aging, and we do lose a disproportionate number of our older population. And that, I don't know how much we can do about that.
Okay, thank you. We've got some more questions. How does the high outward migration explain the increase in home sales in 2020?
That's a really good question. I mean, everyone kind of scratches their head and says, oh, this doesn't make sense, But let's remember, when we look at the sales, even though they're better than they were a year ago, and they're healthy, and they're positive, and the price of homes are going up, we've seen just sort of modest growth in sales. We haven't seen a lot of new inventory coming in. That's one of the reasons why prices, I think, have been increasing. They've been increasing a lot more slowly here than most of the national markets. But it does seem contradictory. But we also are seeing an increase in vacancy in rental housing. So some of that increase in vacancy are people moving from rentals into home ownership. And some of course, that increased vacancy is a result of loss of population. But yeah, it is strange, but the numbers are pretty small. So that can occur. In other words, and obviously, if we continue to see a loss of population, it will catch up to the real estate market. I mean, it already has. Just think, if our population was growing right now, our real estate market would even be that much more robust than it is today. So it is having an effect.
All right, this next one is not so much a question, but a comment. It's from James, and it says, Neal rules. Always so good to hear your thoughts. Thank you, Neal.
I appreciate that comment. This Zooming is kind of challenging. I wish, it's much nicer to be able to see people's reactions and their faces when we're presenting. Many of you already know that. We all know that because just, in-person meetings makes things richer.
Definitely. I've got a question from Stu. Will the price on construction materials come down over 2020 prices as manufacturers come back to full employment and transportation bottlenecks ease up?
Oh, I think that I don't know if prices will come down. That'll be interesting because, with the national economy, most people think that the national economy is really some people are predicting real robustness in the national economy during the next couple of years. If that occurs, I'm not sure the prices of building materials are going to come down very much because I think demand could actually be very strong. I think the bottlenecks are certainly going to be worked out and are being worked out.
From Alexander, do you have a graph for the last 20 years showing state spending versus state income and what effects the deficit will have over the next few years?
Well, we don't have a deficit. I'm not sure if this is a national deficit or the US deficit that's being talked about. We don't have a deficit. We do have a deficit in Alaska. We've had savings to fill that deficit for the last at least 4 or 5 years. And that is a huge challenge for Alaska. There's no doubt. And it definitely is one of the things that is challenge our ability to grow. It was one of the reasons why we haven't been. Nationally, it's going to be very interesting, I think. I think we're moving into a whole new world.
Okay, this is anonymous. Do you have an analysis on the tax implications of each of these industries and what portions of the economy most or least support government spending?
I don't. We don't deal with tax. We don't operate in the tax arena. We let other people do that, the Department of Revenue. But there is, yes, they do have very good analysis of what taxes contribute to the revenues of the state's budget or state revenues. It's very bizarre right now. Last year or this year, I think, and maybe this year as well, federal government's playing the biggest role. And now it's the earnings from the permanent fund that's playing either the largest or second largest role. It's not direct oil revenues anymore. So we've seen that shift sort of take place. So we're seeing some pretty dramatic shifts take place. Now, the federal government's role, obviously, I think, in years going out is going to be reduced. But it's, the state, I think, is receiving another $1 billion this year as a result of the most recent legislation.
Okay, we've got quite a few more questions. You ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. Peter is asking, the governor has requested a 5 million dividend this year. What would that give a shot in the arm to the economy or cause more damage to the state, in your opinion?
That's a public policy question that I'll let someone else talk about.
All right. How do we fight the unemployment crisis we are fighting when people are making twice as much sitting at home than they would at work? Do we raise wages at work or add more criteria to unemployment?
You know, that's an interesting question, and there's no doubt that some of that's going on. I don't know how much longer it is. I mean, the new legislation has increased the amount through September of this year, but generally, you know, because we have state unemployment and we now have the federal government adding to that weekly payment. It'll be interesting to see because Alaska's unemployment payments have actually declined significantly as a percent of covering lost wages. But you know, we'll see as our economy begins to recover and we start seeing employment growth, how easy it will be for employers to find workers.
Okay. Nadine would like to know, can you share with us what percent of the out migration is retirees compared to those active in the labor market?
I don't know what percent. I mean, we have the data and we can get that for you. We have migration by age right now in 5-year increments, and a disproportionate number of the retiree population does move. I mean, and that's always been true. But what hasn't always been true is that right now we're losing population at every age group. That is very unusual, but that is what is happening now. But the and so that data does exist. You'd have to contact me or send me an email and I can send you, we have people that, if you look at the most recent issue of March's Alaska Economic Trends, and you can just Google that, I think it talks about that in that particular article.
Okay. For a young family with 2 working professional parents, would you recommend moving to the lower 48 for better opportunities, given the grim outlook in Alaska?
No, I would not. I mean, I actually think, you know, the one really big benefit for people that are looking for jobs in Alaska, and I've seen this for many, many years, is the biggest generator of economic or employment opportunity is turnover. And we get a lot of it in Alaska. Alaska's population turns over more than anywhere else in the country. And that in itself provides opportunity. I don't think the job market's that bad right now, especially for professionals, people with skills. And so, no, I would not, you know, and Alaska's probably a wonderful place to raise kids. No, you know, it's when we see these numbers, but then you have to realize that we churn a lot and churn creates opportunities. So no, I would not.
Thank you. Raymond would like to know if you can contrast the residential real estate market to the commercial real estate market.
That's an interesting one, and I think it's a very different story. The problem is we don't have a lot of good data on the commercial real estate market. We actually kind of leave that up to others to do, and their BOMA, for example, and other groups have generated, but there isn't a lot of good data on the commercial market. I think parts of the commercial market are doing just fine, and then other parts are not. I mean, you can imagine parts that are tied to retail. That's a real struggle, and that's not new, but it's become even worse as a result of COVID and the growth of e-commerce, and it's become a bigger challenge. As far as office space, you know, that's a huge question mark right now, I think, for a lot of folks in that sector, not just in this state, but elsewhere as well. What is that post-COVID work life going to look like? And I don't know that yet. And we don't, it appears it's going to change, and it could be a challenge. Then the industrial side, most people think it's doing all right. But there isn't the good data that we have so much good data on the residential side of the real estate market.
With the price of wood skyrocketing, can that affect new home construction or help the timber industry?
Well, I think it does both. It's certainly good for the timber industry. I'm sure they love it, just like I love it when the price of oil goes to $100 a barrel, and tell people to quit complaining about high oil prices, gas prices, because it's good for Alaska in general. It may not be good for other places, but it certainly makes housing less affordable. There's no doubt it does put some drag on the new residential real estate market. How much? That's hard to tell, because at the same time, if the economy is healthy, there's going to be a strong demand for it as well. But it's probably not good for Alaska. It's a net negative. In Canada, it's probably a big positive.
Here's a question from Robert. Do you think Alaska can capitalize on the increased shift to remote work as part of the COVID response and attract professionals employed out of the state?
And that's a really fascinating question that every state is trying to contemplate or trying to benefit from. I don't know the answer to that. That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think potentially we might be able to. I have a son who's been working in tech in San Francisco for the last 6 years. He's been working remotely in Alaska, come home for the last year. He's still working for the same company. They're all working remote. And he thinks, as a business opportunity, and I think it's a more realistic one, is that they could attract people to work remotely here from a seasonal basis, in a niche market. People interested in winter sports, people interested in summer sport. The trouble is, at the same time that would be going on, we have a big visitor sector. Overall, I don't know yet whether we'd be a net beneficiary of that or a net loser. It's an interesting question, though, and we've contemplated. I'm just not sure.
How did native corporations weather in 2020?
I can't answer that question. I don't know. I have not seen anything specifically, although because native corporations, really represent the whole state's economy, whether it's in the oil sector or the visitor sector or construction, or you may name it, retail. I suspect, they felt it in a similar way as the rest of the business community has. If they're in the oil sector, it hasn't been good for them. If they've been in the visitor sector, it's been lousy. If they've been in the sort of the tech sector, maybe it's been a little bit better.
Here's a question from Stephanie. Maybe could you provide an explanation for the decline in home building? We've heard that from builders that they are reluctant to sell on spec because material costs have been increasing so rapidly.
Yeah, I can't. I really can't. I don't know. I can't answer that question. I know Fairbanks has done well. The demand has changed there. A lot of it's probably military related. One of the constraints Anchorage supposedly have is a land restraint. It certainly increases prices, but they said that about Seattle 30 years ago, and Seattle built more houses 3 or 4 years ago than they ever did. I mean, a different kind of home. But I really don't know what the real estate market is. Just a fascinating, interesting market. I think it's fairly balanced right now, actually.
Okay. Here's a question from Larry. Do you have any projections for government grants on roadway and infrastructure?
No, I don't have any more. I mean, I don't see that changing in this next year. But, they keep on talking about a giant infrastructure bill, a national one, but they've been talking about that for a long time. Is that more likely to happen? I don't know. That's really a political question, but it is being discussed a lot right now. As far as our capital budgets, they've been pretty darn flat for a long time.
What all is included in the $48 per hour income? Benefits?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I think that we were discussing a $48 per hour income, and this person is wanting to know if that would include benefits, or is that just the full hour?
Well, it depends. We produce wage data, and we don't include benefits in that because it's very hard to collect benefit data because it's so varied. But in some cases, when benefits are reported, and I would it is included. So I don't know. Benefits, on average, I think, run between 15 and 25% of a salary or an hourly wage if you include benefits. Our data that we produce every year by occupation, by location, by area, excludes benefits.
Here's a question from Rick. As a general rule, can Alaska do anything to control its economy, or are we stuck merely reaction to events elsewhere?
That's a really good question. I mean, most, economies sort of, are sort of an organic creature. They sort of operate on their own. How much we can influence them is a really, good question. We can't influence really the price of oil, the price of minerals. We can't, how well is the national economy going to do? And that will ultimately determine, how many visitors we're going to get. I think a lot of that is, I wouldn't say it was on autopilot, but, we might be able to influence it around the margins. But, the economy is sort of as a creature that sort of operates on its own. We can do negative things to it and slightly positive things to it. But generally, the economy kind of operates, independently, on its own.
Okay, I have an attendee who would like to ask a question live, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute David. Okay, David, go ahead with your question.
Looks like David's still muted.
Okay, let's try it again here.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Okay, good. Glad to see you, Neal. It's Dave Morgan from Commonwealth Morgan. I just wanted to tell you, I'm doing a study on out in the valley, and why their medical stuff is done so well during the lockdown here in Anchorage is the Providence Hospital Clinic there, and their hospital, which has a connection to the Mayo Clinic, is catching a lot of patients that couldn't get services. A lot of cancer type diagnoses are considered optional and not critical. And it's turning out that there's been a shift of patients going there because they couldn't get in here during the first half of the pandemic. And I can also tell you through a Commonwealth North study, the reason we lose so many retired people is healthcare costs are about half from their pension studies of the retired employees from the municipality that do go south in the standard of living. But what I really wanted to ask is, I think an interesting study is to see who is actually buying these houses and why. I was here during the 80s, and a lot of real estate, especially housing, was purchased not so much to move into, maybe put a renter or two in them, but were basically bought like stock to be used in the future to be sold. I think that'd be an interesting study. And another study that would be interesting, because I don't have the resources, I'd love to know the savings rate of Alaskans. I would suspect, just like the rest of the country, it's grown considerably, that we're saving a lot more so we can leave, I think. So I would, this summer I worked for the Census Bureau doing some econ work. I'm a healthcare guy, but we found, I think you're going to see the new census say we've lost about 40,000 net people. I don't know if that's jiving with your numbers or not.
I don't know what you mean by 40,000 from when to when. Our numbers are better than theirs, but
between the last census and this
and the last sentence, that's possible, I think. I mean,
Remember,
it depends what you mean by loss, but our numbers are usually very close to their numbers, our total numbers.
I'm talking about between one census
Right,
and this census, which is a 10-year thing.
right.
Okay, well, I wanted to suggest a couple of things to look at. Mainly, the valley was not locked down medically like we were here in the municipality. And there was a shift of patients, primarily to the very large Providence Clinic out there, but also the hospital and their access to the Mayo Clinic. And it's because of this technology. You could have a Mayo Clinic oncologist or even a primary care guy working with their physician there in the valley to do prescribing and to provide treatment via like Afghan is done in the Indian Health Service, but for non-tribal patients. So you had the tribes have a big clinic, you have Providence, basically those patients were shipped. So I'll send that to you when I get it done. Okay,
Okay.
you can use it. I'll give you carte blanche. That's all.
All right.
Thank you, David. Okay, I have another question. This will be a live question. Michael, I'm going to unmute you. Okay, Michael, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, you're still not unmuted.
Forward. We are waiting to hear from you. You just need to unmute. Michael, are you there? You can unmute yourself. Okay, we'll circle back. I've got a couple of other questions to read to you, Neal. Do you have any data that speaks to how much economic activity is generated from the cannabis industry? It looks like there are about 106.8 million in sales from the last year, for example. I'm just curious what kind of multiplier effect that sales load might equate to. Thank you.
Yeah, I have no idea what the multiplier is. We did do a study on it a couple of years ago. We have not updated it. And as you know, it's changed dramatically. I mean, it's grown dramatically. So at this point, the answer is no, I can't. I suspect we'll revisit that because the numbers have changed quite dramatically. I mean, it's probably been the fastest growing part of retail. And it's not just retail, obviously.
Okay. I have lived in Alaska since 2017, working remote. Considering the exodus from California and some other high-cost areas, do you think an effort from the state or larger cities to attract remote workers would show a significant return?
It might. I mean, it'll be interesting. I mean, Alaska's not the only one that's thinking about that, or Anchorage, or wherever we are living. I think a lot of places around the country are doing that right now. It will just be interesting. I just don't know what the average consumer worker where they really want to live. That's really kind of, to me, it's still sort of an unknown. But I think it's an interesting question, and I suspect we have folks here in Alaska that are looking at trying to attract that part of the workforce. And there's some of that already. I mean, but there's some of that already in a lot of places. The question is whether we're going to be a net beneficiary or not of that. Because remember, people can do jobs somewhere else that are related to activity that are taking place here in Alaska as well.
Okay, that completes our Q&A. Thank you very much, Neal. Marty, would you like to close it up?
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Marie. Thanks, Neal. So everybody listen, we really, truly appreciate you all coming today. I know you had a lot to do. Your schedules are busy. You're market leaders in your industry, and really appreciate that. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts here at Crescent. Neal, that was really great. I think my head's spinning a little bit. I got some more questions to pick your brain on, so I'll probably be reaching out to you as time goes on, so I appreciate that. I'd like to really take a moment to thank and recognize Eaton for putting forth the resources for us to bring this to you all. I hope you all found it helpful and interesting. This will be something that will most likely become an annualized event for us, and we hope to see you again in future endeavors. We have a little bit of a statement here on the slide. I'd read it to you, but I think you had a little while to take a look at it and read it of your own volition. But thank you again, and we really appreciate it, and we look forward to hearing from you guys. If you have any needs that we can work with you into the market, or if we can direct questions to Neal, whatever we can do to bring value to you. So thank you.
Thank you. This closes our meeting.